for everyone who's joining us, this format of the panel this morning and in the afternoon was really kind of introduced to me by the illustration conference at Washington University in St. Louis last year. And it just consists of what was called then a kind of lightning presentation, so short presentations by graduate students. And so I want to hand things over to Susanna Cole, who will be chairing this panel. Thanks, Susanna.
Thank you, Michael. And also thank you, Stephanie and Rich and everybody at the Rockwell Center. It's been a real pleasure working with everyone. And I also wanted to, before I went into detailed introductions, I just wanted to thank the panelists and acknowledge their flexibility and enthusiasm and professional determination, considering the incredibly difficult times in which we've decided to forge ahead with this conference. And I'm grateful that you've all done that, because we have 3 really terrific presentations ahead of us. And I look forward to also having a discussion with the 3 of you about your work. I'm going to introduce, because of the format and the sort of lightning, the speed of the presentations, I'm going to introduce the panelists first all together, and I'm going to introduce them in the order in which they're going to be presenting. The order is going to be that Julia Hammer-Light is presenting from the University of Delaware, and she will be presenting a paper called Perilous Print Culture: Speed and Stability in the Lithographs of the Awful Conflagration of the Steamboat Lexington, 1840. Julia is a first-year PhD student in art history at the University of Delaware. Her doctoral work will focus on concepts of craft in the United States during the latter 19th and early 20th century. Her research interests include print culture related to American imperialism, technology, and disaster. She received a BA in American Studies from Yale University and has previously held positions at the Yale University Gallery and the Toledo Museum of Art, and as well as the Minneapolis Institute of Art. Our second panelist today is Rebecca Szantyr from Brown University. She will be presenting Visualizing Difference, Race, Illustration, and the Cries of New York in Antebellum America. Rebecca is a graduate of Vassar College and the Case Western Reserve University Cleveland Museum of Art program in art history. Rebecca is currently a PhD candidate in History of Art and Architecture at Brown University, where she is writing her dissertation on Nicolino Kallio, A Wider View of American Art, 1833 to 1855. From 2015 to 2018, she was the Florence B. Selden Fellow in the Department of Print and Drawing at Yale University Art Gallery, where she curated the exhibition Seriously Funny: Caricature Through the Centuries. Her research has been supported by the American Antiquarian Society, the Library Company of Philadelphia, and the Winther Museum, Garden and Library. Our final panelist is Marina Wells from Boston University. She will be presenting From Book to Bone: The Lives of Female Pirate Illustrations. Marina Wells is a third-year PhD student in American and New England Studies program at Boston University. She holds a bachelor's in art history and English from Colby College. She studies how objects and visuals become complexly gendered in homosocial male environments, employing the lens of feminist and queer theory to examine animal products such as 18th century powder horns and 19th century scrimshaw. So I'm looking forward to all of these, and I think there are so many interesting connections between the work that you're all doing. As I have told the panelists previously, I hope this conversation between them and audience members continues well beyond the presentations. And I'd like to begin. So Julia, can you?
Okay, thanks everyone for being here today, and thanks to everyone who made this possible. So today I'm looking at the lithographs that represented the awful conflagration of the steamboat Lexington in 1840 to consider how illustration has been used to turn disaster into spectacle. When the steamboat Lexington began running between New York and Connecticut, it was advertised as the People's Line because it had previously broken up a monopoly on steam transportation. And on the night of January 13th, 1840, nearly 150 were on board when the Lexington left New York City for Stonington, Connecticut. But around 7:30 that evening, a fire broke out. Fires were common on steamboats. In fact, the Lexington had been on fire before. But this one got out of hand. Both of the ship's safety boats foundered, and the fire engine and buckets were used improperly. As flames consumed the vessels, passengers had to choose between staying and burning or jumping and freezing. The ship foundered on a Monday evening just 32 miles away from Manhattan, but it was 4 years before the invention of the telegraph, and news of the fire did not reach New York City until the morning of Wednesday, January 15th. That afternoon, although the penny press newspaper The New York Sun usually ran as a morning paper, it printed a special edition with the first description of the tragedy. The next morning, January 16th, the same paper printed the first lithograph illustrating the disaster, entitled The Awful Conflagration of the Steamboat Lexington. No versions of that first print have been uncovered, but according to scholars James Brust and Wendy Shadwell, this was likely the same image. The lithograph and all of the following versions were printed above text. The artist of this image is unknown, and the boat, and the boat is at a standstill, set back in the frame on the horizon line as it's consumed by flames. But although this was the first edition, it wasn't the best known version. Nearly a week after the first lithograph appeared, a second one was advertised in the Sun. The Daily read that the new lithograph would, quote, far surpass anything of the kind yet provided, by representing the, quote, calamity as a night scene. The composition remains much the same, but now in Technicolor, and the print includes the names of the artist W.K. Hewitt and publisher Nathaniel Currier, although we're unsure if those were the same as the earlier print. Here, the ghostly figures disappear beneath the waves, now faint and transparent against the bright blue of the water in the foreground. The conflagration is much more prominent in the composition, and the perspective has become steeper. Each adjustment heightens the drama of the scene, edging the disaster away from tragedy and towards spectacle. 5 days after this second version appeared, the Sun announced that it had sold between 12,000 and 13,000 editions. Its normal readership was 60,000 people. The collaboration with Currier turned out to be wildly successful. The text changed from one printing to another, as did the number of people who perished, but the image itself remained roughly the same. So, why did these prints become such a sensation? In this paper, I propose that accelerating transportation and technological change explains why these prints circulated so quickly and so broadly. The importance of speed must be understood in two dimensions. The first is supply. Currier and the Sun produced an incredible number of prints incredibly quickly, thanks in part to a steam printing press, which allowed images of the event to circulate faster than ever before. And the second is demand. By fixing the event on the page, the image of the burning steamboat provided consumers with a way to deal with anxiety over rapid technological change in the contemporary world by turning an industrial disaster into spectacle. The speed with which Nathaniel Currier published the prints of the Lexington cemented his reputation in New York, but a different disaster had sparked his career. In 1835, a fire ravaged 13 acres of the city. Just 4 days after, Currier advertised a lithograph of the ruins of the Merchants Exchange, New York. Thousands of copies of this print sold. And just as he would do with the Lexington, Currier also produced a hand-colored lithograph as a marketing technique to sell more images of the disaster. In the bottom right corner, a well-dressed couple stands. The conflagration has been contained, the composition seems to say, and so it is safe to approach the ruins as spectators out on a promenade rather than mourners. The prints themselves here picture spectatorship as part of disaster. And just as speed had spurred Currier's success, steam became successful because of the speed it introduced to transportation in antebellum America. The process, however, was rough, not smooth. Explosions were part of the system. This later image of a steamboat race, published by Nathaniel Currier's firm Currier and Ives in 1866, is how antebellum Americans wanted to picture the ships: incredible, miraculous machines that annihilated space and time, enabling the expansion of United American imperialism. Contemporaries used illustrations to show what historian Walter Johnson has called the steamboat sublime, rendering volatility as inevitable as a hurricane. But with some regularity, speed would strain a boiler until it exploded. So contemporary antebellum Americans used illustration to make sense of how steam annihilated human lives. In later lithographs of the awful conflagration of the steamboat Lexington, a small map of Long Island Sound appears beneath the image of the blaze. New York is marked by a faint grid to the far left. A smudge of smoke identifies the point where the Lexington burned. Through representing the location of the awful conflagration, the lithograph translates the disaster into real space. In the process, it locates both the viewer and the spectacle, emphasizing and stabilizing the distance between them. People could read the story, examine the print, tuck it under their arm to take it home. Many of the lithographs of the conflagration are preserved separate from their text, suggesting that consumers might have displayed the print on a wall or kept it as a more convenient memento. As the prints of the Lexington transformed disasters from tragedy to spectacle, the consequence of the pressures of capitalism themselves became commodities. In the image, the steamboat occupies the center of the frame, not the victims. The people that are present are well dressed, seemingly unharmed, except for the few figures sinking beneath the waves. In closing, although I focused on a single and early instance here, the prints of the awful conflagration of the steamboat Lexington offer a broader opportunity to consider how illustration in motion has been used to construct technological disaster in the public eye. They invite us to consider how illustrations can create emblems or icons, carefully bounding events within a frame to alleviate a sense of anxiety or danger. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia.
Yeah.
And now can we turn our attention to Rebecca, who will present Visualizing Difference.
Thanks so much. Again, I just want to iterate the comments of some other, of Stephanie and Michael and the panels who have gone before me. It's really great that we are able to hold this in such trying times. Okay. In the mid-1840s, the Neapolitan American artist Nicolino Cagliò created a series of lively watercolors capturing the peddlers of foodstuffs and household goods who conducted their business on the streets of the city. Consisting of over 100 discrete compositions, the impetus for this body of work was Cagliò's role in the contributing illustrator for publisher John Doggett's 1846 edition of The Cries of New York, which featured verses by the celebrated poet Francis Sargent Osgood. Unlike other sets of New York cries, Cagliò's drawings depicted African Americans as part of the city's thriving economy, as entrepreneurs, workers, and consumers, a simple but radical gesture for the period. In one extant set of 53 drawings, Cagliò included African Americans in 14, or nearly a quarter of the compositions, when at the time the city's Black population was under 7%. Yet, when Cagliò's designs were translated into print for reproduction in Doggett's book, only one of the 15 illustrations included a person of color. As a chimney sweep, a stereotypical African American trade, where, like bootblacks, the very material association with their labor, dark soot, soot, or shoe polish, becomes a metonymical index for their skin. The goal of my brief talk today is to parse through why Cagliò's other illustrations of African Americans suffered similar editorial and their exclusion from Doggett's final publication, ultimately resulting in a diminished visibility. For those unfamiliar with the genres of cries, Cagliò's images follow in a long tradition. The scene emerged around 1500 as a series of popular woodcuts that catalog the pedestrian hawkers of Paris and their distinct sing-songing cries, or auditory advertisements for their wares. By the end of the 17th century, with the publication of Marcellus Leroun's intaglio, The Cries of London Drawn from Life, such prints were elevated into luxury items, spawning many popular and finer imitations. Cagliò's native Naples had its own tradition, developed in the late 18th century, catering to tourists and armchair travelers' interest in the city. By the turn of the 19th century, the genre had crossed the Atlantic, where it was primarily adopted as a subject in the juvenile market, either as a travelogue or as a reading primer. It is through this lens that we must consider Cagliò's designs. not as mere illustrations, but as cultural production through which publishers use children's literature to shape the social discourse about the visibility of difference. Collio's drawings of the Old Straw Man and the Butter and Milk Man are two such designs that did not make the final cut for Doggett's edition of Cries, likely for their inaccuracy. Both of these drawings feature individuals who can be identified as cartmen, the term for those who sold or transported goods in a horse-drawn wagon. As a lucrative form of unskilled labor, carting required a license. But like other employment that fell under the municipality's purview, be it in an administration or through other trades that required permits, African Americans and recent immigrants were barred from entering the cartman profession. This exclusion served to further marginalize and disenfranchise these groups from the circles of political influence that operated within the city. As indicated by the error in the original inscription for this drawing, Collio likely looked at an earlier woodcut of a man hawking buttermilk and planning his own design. However, in updating the peddler's humble conveyance of a wheelbarrow for a cart, Collio's drawing could immediately no longer be from life, as purported on the book's title page, a fact already surmised from the generalized features of this African-American cartman. In the published version, a white milkman's cart reveals that he is from New Jersey, a then rural locale that suggests the milk's salubrious rather than adulterated nature, allaying common fears about dairy products made from bovines raised within the city. Collio's original design for the baker's cart demonstrates that other modifications have been made for the publication. In the artist's drawing, a young African-American woman receives a plated loaf from the white baker. In the final version, the customer has been moved to the near side of the cart, with her back facing the viewer. This alteration to Collio's design may have been to fit Osgood's poem, which includes a reference to the, quote, the hidden face neath that funny-looking bonnet, unquote. However, the fair skin visible on the back of the girl's neck and hands indicates that she is white, another reworking of Collio's composition. This adjustment may have been prompted by Osgood's verse, which hints at the youthful flirtation. In Osgood's poem and in the printmaker's translation of Collio's design, it is not the baker himself on the cart, but the baker's man, a cap-wearing, full-cheeked apprentice, not the brim-hatted adult in the source drawing. According to Osgood's rhyme, the young man extends a long and longing gaze towards the girl's face, and through puns, he is described as an unsuitable match. Even though Osgood's tone is humorous and the young man is regarded as undesirable, any suggestion of interracial intimacies would have been unthinkable in a children's book, and thus Collio's customer needed to be amended. The artist's inclusion of a Black female consumer in this drawing was a decision of artistic license, and that the skin color of the customer was not determined by an outside convention or custom. Can the same be said of other non-stereotypical, non-racialized depictions of Black labor? In my last case study, I examined Collio's drawing, The Hot Corn Seller. Was Collio's decision to cast this figure as an African-American one that prompted conscious visibility, or was it one of custom? Unlike other cries of foodstuffs, hot corn was without European precedent, a fact proudly mentioned in versions of American cries. A survey of hot corn illustrations and text from the first half of the 19th century reveal how this particular cry was altered in Maulonday's 1825 edition, where the author noted that hot corn was, quote, boiled in the husk and carried about the streets in pails and large bowls, and with a little salt sold for a penny an ear, principally by colored women, unquote. A noticeable change from earlier publications. As the very genre of cries capitalized in centuries of convention and often utilized printing matrices for as long as possible, any pictorial adjustments indicate a wish to match reader expectations amid demographic changes. Contemporary newspapers include sellers' race and gender in accounts of involving hot corn sellers, which underscore the association between African-American women and the vending of hot corn. With the price of corn public knowledge, vendors could only charge a penny or two more than the wholesale price, and any profits must also deduct the expenses of cooking fuel, salt, and butter. Hence, their earnings were extremely modest and seasonal, since fresh corn was only available late summer and early autumn. Although the central image depicts children delighting in the treat, both the selling and consuming of hot corn was primarily a nocturnal activity, and that the women only undertook the supplemental work after a day of laboring elsewhere. Customers were often late-night revelers who congregated around hot corn stands after the city's taverns, theaters, and pleasure gardens closed, and the female proprietors were often witnesses or victims of rowdy and criminal behavior. It is more likely for this reason that Doggett elected to not include Collio's illustration of a hot corn cellar, not out of any prejudices, but that the occupation and reality of hot corn selling was not a suitable subject for children. In closing, I present 2 additional images of hot corn cries that are contemporary to Collio's drawing. However, unlike other printed illustrations I've shown today, these images appeared in publications for adult audiences. Not only have the artists depict these hot corn sellers as white, but in their respective texts, these figures are described as children, despite the hinted at bosom of the young woman on the left. Solange Robinson's account of Little Katie, which was later adapted into a novel and theatrical review, is credited with giving rise to the trend of hot corn journalism, the lurid and often salacious reportage devoted to lifting the veil on the lives of the urban underclasses. The sensationalism of these texts not only attracted readers, but aided these so-called investigations in becoming fodder for reformers hoping to improve the conditions of the city poor. But as these 2 hot corn sellers suggest, publishers and illustrators knew that the faces that would invoke sympathy would not belong to the typical hot corn seller, that is to say, a work-weary African-American woman, but rather an imagined fair-skinned sprite of the city's gutters and alleyways. If the cries genre had originated as a taxonomy to order the different sounds and peoples one encountered in an urban environment, then by the mid-19th century, publishers were determining for their middle-class readerships not only what the limits of these differences could be, but also what these differences looked like. Thank you.
All right, so thanks to everybody who's tuning in today, despite the circumstances, and thanks also to everybody who made today possible. And I'll dive right in. So Charles Elm's 1837 volume, The Pirate's Own Book, resurrected Alwilda, a woman from Norse lore, and describes how she embraced life as a rover and attired as a man. Not long after its publication, a remarkable number of whalemen carved Alwilda's image onto the teeth of their ketch in a process called scrimshaw. While whalemen regularly transferred images from literature onto whale ivory, Alwilda stands out as a popular figure for this process. She was not a conventionally beautiful lady who sailors often extracted from fashion magazines, but a woman who dressed as a man and turned to piracy. Her story dramatized the possibilities of women transgressing the boundaries of a male social world, homosocial world, the very world that these scrimshaw carvers themselves actually inhabited. Thus, on scrimshaw, the popular image of the female pirate reveals an interest in gender performativity and the possibility of its subversion on 19th century whale ships. Mariners carried aboard a number of periodicals, books, other publications, which they bought in port cities, borrowed from libraries, or exchanged among ships that met at sea. To uncover what exactly sailors read, book historians have looked to journals and shipboard book lists, but scrimshaw offers another significant avenue of evidence. Scrimshaw connoisseurs have matched carvings to their origins in print, demonstrating that scrimshanders often copied scenes from various sources, frequently extracting mainstream images from Godey's Lady's Book, Harper's Monthly, and in this case, Gleason's. Motifs of all sorts appear, including images of sailors, symbols, domestic scenes ashore, historical figures. However, women's fashion illustrations are perhaps the most ubiquitous. So in observing the prominence of the categories of scrimshaw of and for women, connoisseurs have reified the idea that the medium makes visual the inherent masculine, heterosexual desires of its makers. Sailors thought about women incessantly, according to this logic. Surely men became lonely and bored on lengthy whaling voyages, and scrimshaw helped to actively and imaginatively fill those voids. However, Alwilda's presence and her popularity complicates these passive assertions of masculinity and heterosexuality as essentialized categories. While the text of A Pirate's Own Book describes Alwilda as wearing a casque which covered her visage, the image accompanying the text suggests that it is not an absence, but rather her masculine presence that comprises her disguise. She's flat-chested, short-haired, aggressively wielding a cutlass over her head, and in Alwilda's brief story, as well as other antebellum narratives of seafaring women, This sartorial transformation is remarkably passive. She simply becomes attired as a man. As a result, the text endows her with other gendered traits, although there's no logical connection between her manly attributes and the clothes she wears. The text describes Alwilda as formidable and as having great courage and talent in her piratic adventures. Her change of gender, then, is not only physical, as the illustration emphasizes. Her popular story and image suggests that masculine traits naturally accompany external appearance. However, this pairing of appearance and traits paradoxically rejects biological essentialism, as it defies the logic of her biology as a woman. Given this, Alwilda's character complicates assumptions about the existence of inherently gendered traits. And her popularity suggests that readers were actually interested in questioning the very authority of gender categories themselves. It's safe to assume that Alwilda, in both image and in plot, captured the imagination of Maturin Murray Ballou, another author of Fanny Campbell, the Female Pirate Captain, originally published in 1844. Appearing a mere 7 years after Alwilda in popular literature, Fanny Campbell was another female pirate who was popular among whalemen. Her fictional story tells how she went to sea during the American Revolution. She incited mutiny on a British vessel so she could rescue her imprisoned lover. Like Alwilda, she also experienced a physical transformation wherein she suddenly appeared as a man, and her external change accompanied internal changes wherein she gained masculine aggression, level-headed confidence, and sudden maritime mastery. The book illustrations of Alwilda and Fanny's female masculinity are perhaps consistent with other period depictions of masculine pirates, including those also found within a pirate's own book. Like the cross-dressing women, a pirate's identity was also understood to be liminal, even queer, as they existed beyond boundaries and explored non-normative desire. The kind of rambunctious but authoritative masculinity these pirates exhibit was also a connotation of scrimshaw as a medium. Scrimshaw, consisting of teeth and bone, is a byproduct of a gory homosocial process and therefore cannot be separated from these aesthetics of violence. Marketing strategies, as you can see here in the Northeast, that helped to generate this form of masculinity date back to the 18th century. The men-only culture of adventure, risk, and danger, explicitly in whaling scenes, was not effaced from whaling products, but was rather celebrated. Therefore, pieces of whalebone and ivory were and are metonyms of violent, economic, masculine success. While scrimshaw is rarely erotic, explicit, or even remotely suggestive of sexual deviance, these examples do approach the queer, the liminal, the fluid, an interest that could not have been direct in its own time, but that also still remains unacknowledged in current scholarship. This analysis intends to scratch the surface of this pairing of so-called canvas and image to understand why these illustrations were so exceptionally mobile, moving between shipboard texts and whaling-specific material culture. Therefore, taking Scrimshander's visual interests alongside cultural practices around gender and sexuality can perhaps offer a more complete understanding of shipboard possibility and reality. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank all of you for these really, really terrific and interesting. I know I loved this idea of these very sort of brief but packed presentations as a way that we could begin to dive into each of your topics. And then as I read each of them, it made me realize really the commonalities between them. And so I'd actually like to ask a couple questions about sort of some common themes that I see, and you all can answer them as it moves you. So the first thing that I wanted to ask that perhaps in larger versions of this project you all discuss is actually about the space in which these figures sort of they occupy. Okay, the term liminal was used by Marina, And I think that in many ways, that is a term that could be applied to each of the papers that you gave. Whether it's the ship at sea, the boat sort of floundering in the Sound, or the sort of the individual types of workers within the street, right? These aren't private spaces, they're public spaces, they're often transgressive spaces, or spaces that are associated with transgressive behavior. And also spaces in which there's the potential for allowed transgressions, right, that don't necessarily meet the social conduct of more formalized interior spaces. So if you all, I know it's hard to have a sort of impromptu conversation over Zoom, but whoever would like to sort of address that first in terms of their paper, just maybe even just raise.
Yeah, I'm happy to go first.
Great. Thanks, Marina.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'm very interested in the ocean in particular as a liminal, an exceptionally liminal or fluid perhaps environment, both in imagination and also literally. So I think that these women and their ability to, even if it's just an imagined ability to transgress gender boundaries, even if it's just the male authors of these stories imagining this ability to transgress these boundaries, the ocean is the perfect, it's an exceptional space for that, outside of national borders. And to add to the spatial component of it, also temporally, these are stories that are told about wartime. So that also, as a kind of liminal space of its own, adds to the ability for a kind of fluidity of identity. And so, yeah, I would say that it's not only just the space, but also the kind of choice of time period as well for those stories.
Yeah, and I actually, so talking of ships and sea, that was an intersection that I saw really strongly with your presentation, Marina. These sort of images of ships burning were actually shockingly popular during the 19th century, and also I think in the 18th century. And some of them also intersect with like whaling disasters. There were a lot of images that circulated of whaling disasters, of other ships being broken apart. And one of the things that I was thinking about is the imagery of the ship has been really popular and powerful in the United States for a long time. The image of the ship of state has been a metaphor for the nation itself in the Constitution. And that was very popular during the 19th century. And so I think, I mean, and then even today, you can see ships and their resonance and how we're thinking about destabilizing influences. So that was something I was thinking about. And then also the liminality of print culture and illustration in motion. I don't know if you guys ran into this with your work, but when I was looking at these illustrations, there are a lot of them now in collections, like at the American Antiquarian Society and at the Winterthur Library, but often it's almost impossible to trace how they were purchased, who first purchased them, how they were saved, how they entered collections clearly. And so there is also this liminality of the life of the object before it enters into a collection. And so with mine, all of them were originally printed with the image above and then the text below. But so many of them, as I mentioned, were separated eventually. And that's how a lot of them are preserved. And so those sorts of actions are really hard to access when thinking about these sorts of images, despite seemingly, it seems like they must have importance to how the images were used.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Julia, I think that that you're bringing up something that I think is a really important parallel here that you all touched on, which is this portability of illustration, right? And the circulation of it, right? So that the object itself is mobile in some way. And it also is when we, Professor Lobel, Michael brought up the idea of sort of illustration getting its due in some way. And I think the fact that these images have occupied these liminal spaces, right? Whether it's somebody's living room or tucked under their arm, folded, moving through the streets, on a ship, whatever it is, right? Brings up a whole other issue in terms of transgression, right? The transgression of the image in space as well, right?
Yeah. One thing that I just wanted to add in terms of this themes of liminality is that, I mean, I think in terms of the types of images I'm working with in this paper, is that because there were African Americans were scattered throughout the city, living next door to Anglo-Americans, but also that there were separate kind of communities, as in like Little Seneca. So the street becomes a place where these figures are imaged, and it's, but it becomes kind of an imaginary image in the mind of the artist. Like Kallio mostly did draw from life when it comes to his figures, which is maybe not always true of his topographical views. But then when he does sit down, like as we saw in the picture of the cartman, it's not as detailed. It's clearly not from life. But just expanding on that theme of liminality, he's someone himself who Kallio, as the artist, was kind of exploring multiple circles. He's someone who's working with illustration, but also as a fine art artist. So he was moving among these circles, but also as a foreign-born artist, was kind of in the city, but not of the city in some ways.
Yeah, and in terms of following up on that with all three of you, you all also have touched on sort of European counterparts in some way to this. And I was curious to see, in terms of the translation, what you saw within each of these projects as specific to American illustration of this moment in the 19th century, or what you see as in dialogue even with its contemporary European counterpart, British counterpart, or in opposition, directly in opposition to. I think that, Rebecca, I was specifically, in terms of your topic, in terms of how race was dealt with, right? So the in the sort of transition from Europe to the United States, how were these racial types changed, and what were sort of the moralizing themes potentially that translated differently?
Exactly. There's something, I'm trying to think, I'm not as necessarily familiar with strictly contemporary cries in Europe, but something that emerges out of the European tradition is that, right, it works on two levels, because one way of looking at these cries, both historical and in the 19th century, was that there was a sense of familiarity. Like, these are the people who populate your universe. They're outside. That's how you get things, or how maybe your housekeeper gets food, stuff, or vegetables for your table. So it was familiar in that way, and that's why it becomes a subject of children's literature. There's also very much an otherness to it. So even going back to Britain, where these become, prints that are engraved and have etching and are very, very costly, especially for a set of like 74 was the complete set, that it was really, that becomes like a line of division. The fact that these people are imaged in this way is more of a, that's the barrier between the viewer and the subject. But I think in the 19th century, especially children being more open, so you see this book, like it becomes more of a view out the window. And those kind of social interactions might be more welcome, or the idea that one could imagine them in that way.
And is the text that goes along with that, Rebecca, open in the same way, or?
Well, and so it's very interesting. So in the version that Kallio's drawings are used for, the 1846 Doggett one, there's those poems by Fanny Osgood that are mostly very open and give the sellers the benefit of the doubt. Like on the one, the milkman, they're saying like, oh, please tell me that it's milk and not milk and water. But because that edition of a book being so heavily decorated, using a poetess and a known artist, it was definitely marketed for a middle class readership. but sorry, I'm forgetting. But in something that was maybe, so the reading is high level. There's the poems by the poetess, but also the rest of the text, which is not by Fanny Osgood, is a travelogue, and it's more about for what you would expect to see in the city.
Mhm.
Terrific. Julia, you were gonna, I think I interrupted you.
Oh, no, sorry. I was probably just
Okay, it's always
being
hard to
too
tell.
loud. But I do have, there's actually an image that I included in the larger paper that I could share right now to just
That'd be terrific.
demonstrate
Yeah.
how this was used in European context. So the conflagration of the steamboat Lexington actually was pictured around the world, including in this lithograph in France produced after 1840. The date is not entirely known. And I was fascinated when I discovered this lithograph by the stylistic differences between this French produced image and the courier produced images. Here it's almost kind of, I'll see if I can zoom in a little bit, but it looks almost like a Turner painting. And in contrast, the ship is set back much further on the horizon line. It's much less identifiable as a steamboat specifically. The stacks are barely visible. It seems like there are maybe masts pointing up into the ground. And then here the people are much more foregrounded, the central group right here in particular. And everyone is not so much characterized as actually sort of more realistically represented, and everyone's looking towards the ship. And so I did think it was fascinating that in the American context, the conflagration of the steamboat Lexington was pictured in a more bombastic fashion almost, you know. I mean, the perspective which was much more flattened, the hand coloring of the images was really heightened the contrast, and it used blocks of simple colors because of the process of hand coloring required that for efficiency. Whereas this is a totally different style. So it was actually the same image was used, or the same event was pictured across the sea, but to very different purposes from my perspective. I mean, I read that as Europeans being more distanced from the event geographically, and so they could picture the burning of the boat that way, whereas the Americans were actually using the image to sort of distance the event in itself so it was a less realistic representation. And that also just had to do with Courier's style and other lithographic representations of disaster at the time.
Yeah. Yeah, there's also something sort of less graphic about it.
Yeah.
And more in the tradition of 18th and 19th century European topographic travel illustration.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's almost more subdued and falls less into the idea of spectacle culture that you were talking about. And I was actually wondering, in terms of the idea of spectacle culture, were there popular displays around the Steamboat Lexington event? I couldn't help but think about things like panoramas and dioramas and how ripe this event would have been for that type of, as you move into the idea of spectacle culture.
Yeah.
What did that mean for a wide viewing audience?
Yeah, absolutely. So I do not know of any dioramas or panoramas specifically representing the burning of the steamboat Lexington. Obviously, steamboats were extremely popular as subjects for panoramas because they actually gave artists a visual technique to portray movement within the image as it scrolled past. But there is a kind of amazing quote of a man encountering, so the prints of the lithograph, I focused on the prints that were made in New York for the New York Sun, but there were prints of the lithograph printed in Boston, in Hartford, all up and down the East Coast, and stories about its burning were published even in Ohio at the time. And so there's a quote from a man in Boston who is outraged that such an event would be pictured in the front of, I think it was a print shop. It must have been on display, and then a quote saying he thought that it was sort of crass to picture that sort of disaster. And the in the shop windows. So that's not so much someone appreciating the disaster, the picturing of the disaster, but someone responding to that ubiquitous picturing, and the idea that it could become a spectacle so quickly, which sort of points out that so when the print was printed, just for the New York Sun, the readership was about 60,000. And I said 12,000 to 13,000 copies were sold within 5 days, but then they continued to print them. And so a huge number of people purchased these images and took them home. And they remained pretty much unresponsive as the news about the story changed. I think it was Rebecca who talked about how the matrices were sort of resistant to change because it's hard to do that. Same for a lithographic stone. So the image would be repeated and repeated even as the number of deaths changed, you know, or the story below it changed, sort of solidifying it. But yeah, there's not, I mean, that's what, I haven't run into anything in other sort of formats or mediums representing the burning of the steamboat, but that one quote really alerted to me to how ubiquitous the imagery would have been. Yeah,
absolutely. And Marina, I had a question for you in terms of the pirate in slide, is it your third and ninth slide? It's so hard without it in front of me. But she, as opposed to others, she's surrounded by a certain group of symbols, or I couldn't quite tell what were the engraved objects on the scrimshaw that were around her. And I was wondering if you could tell me if there's any sort of code to this that I don't understand, and if that gives some sort of spatial orientation or
Want me to share my screen? That's a really interesting question. So you're talking about these strange...
Yeah, I mean, I see a ship, I think, or several, but I'm wondering about these other symbols that we also then don't see in the illustrations either, or at least maybe it was me, and sort of what, if we have any sense of what's going on there.
No, you're absolutely right. I guess I have a bit of a non-answer for that, but I would say first and foremost that the interesting thing about the translation between these images from print to a not two-dimensional canvas is that the scrimshanders, the artists, could kind of pick and choose what they wanted to relay onto that new form, what they wanted to embellish. You can see here, this is polychrome, whereas the illustration itself was black and white. But it looks like often they would put, you know, just kind of little shapes, or this looks like some kind of almost like a seaweed or something, but perhaps a kind of allusion to terrestrial life, plants, right?
Mm-hmm.
And maybe a little eagle or something up here. So patriotic themes were really very, very common. And of course, we have several ship portraits on the side here.
Mm-hmm.
So not unrelated to kind of an interest in what was around them, what was going on at sea. But I do think it's interesting, if we're looking at these other examples while we have them up, that this almost looks like there's a bit of a rocky shore maybe that the artist has included here.
Mm-hmm.
And kind of lack of a kind of sense of linear space on this other example just demonstrates that there were artists of all kinds taking up this image, and with interests in different kinds of embellishments. And there wasn't always a sense of a master plan for how these canvases were going to come out. I mean, the way that writers on Scrimshaw talk about them is that these men were very bored. They had a lot of time on their hands, and so they spent it, you know, with their ships full of oil on their way home, just kind of scrawling, doodling. But I think that's a little reductive. I think that you're right to ask questions about if there is further meaning to those. But I will give the big reveal that that one piece actually has another woman on the other side of it who is dressed in a woman's dress as a kind of counterpart to Alwilda in her masculine dress. Or that's how I like to think of it anyway, that there's a kind of male and female side, perhaps of the same woman. Yeah, so that's
yeah, well, that's really fascinating in terms of yeah, to think about it in terms of also what we were talking about spectacle culture. You know, that there's almost this transformation that takes place as you turn from one side to another. I was wondering in terms of why you were using the idea of sort of male and female versus a masculine and feminine in your discussion of this figure, because there seems to be a sense in which this female figure is subverting gender norms, but I wasn't sure in terms of beyond the sort of subversion of gender norms, if there actually is there a shift in pronouns that are used in writing about this for this figure? You know, how does this you know, how does this translate for you?
Yeah, that's a really important question, and I apologize for not being more aware of the terminology I'm using. I think that I'm actually importing that from the title of Fanny Campbell, for example, is the female pirate captain, because sex and gender were conflated in the 19th century, right? So this is still something we're kind of working through in the 21st. But fascinatingly, in Fanny Campbell, there is basically the character Fanny Campbell disappears, and then she reappears without explanation as a captain, and the pronouns in the text are changed to he, him. So we are not supposed to kind of know exactly. There's a bit of play with the reader, whether or not we know who this is. And of course, her gender is revealed when she sees her lover, and then they have their re-meeting, they reconvene in a very dramatic scene. So, but you're right to ask those questions, because there isn't a true transition in the way that we think of trans identity today. It's certainly understood in these texts as kind of cross-dressing, wherein that gender transition is kind of revoked at the end, so that these two examples of women both end with a kind of happy heterosexual marriage to a man.
And is there any male counterpart in terms of where we see a sort of feminization of a pirate within the context of dress or masquerade in some way in terms of this literature? Or
interesting question. I would love to hear if anyone in the audience has heard of any in the popular literature or popular images. But I mean, the only thing that I can really think of is in theater and cross-dressing in theater, and plays were performed on shipboard. So cross-dressing perhaps among the same men who were creating these pieces or reading these pieces. It's possible that there was some cross-dressing, especially among the kind of popular performances of sorts of the Neptune ritual of crossing the equator, wherein one of the crew members would dress up as Neptune himself and others as other maritime characters, some of which were female or women. So yeah, if anybody knows of any, I would love to hear a male counterpart. Yeah.
Michael Lobel just mentioned that he has a question for Julia. Is there a way that we can get, there's Michael.
There he is.
Everyone, first of all, I want to thank all of you for your fascinating presentations, and I'm so glad, you know, as I mentioned earlier, I've been working for, you know, a little while thinking about the interface between what's called, for the lack of a better term, art and popular visual culture. And I feel like, you know, it's funny, like just hearing everyone, the morning panel, and then all of you, you know, for now decades, this whole question of visual culture and whether it's viable or not. So I'm actually, you know, incredibly excited that all of you are taking these materials seriously. So I do have a question for Julia, and I'm a little bit worried about asking this question because I think sometimes in my academic sort of mode, I can get a little too clever by half, but I'm going to ask it for you. And if you think it's just kind of ridiculous, you should say that, please.
All right.
But, you know, I've been thinking a lot about 19th century printing and sort of print culture for a variety of reasons, including because of Van Gogh's interest in the kind of British illustrators, like around publications like The Graphic. And so when you mentioned steam presses, I thought about that. And then I thought about the steamboat, and I thought, oh, would there have been any kind of signifying, you know, relationship between images of this steam-powered vehicle and then the vehicle through which the images were printed, right? I mean, so I just wanted to raise that. I think it does seem a little too cute or clever, but I was wondering if you felt it was viable at all.
Yeah, I absolutely was wondering about that when I was writing the paper also, because the moment when the Sun and Nathaniel Currier both became able to produce these images at such a massive scale was the moment when they got the steam-powered press. And other images of the day that were disaster images, this was a tiny bit later, but railroad images of disaster were also extremely popular. And all of that really has to do, I don't know, I was thinking also, I was playing around with the idea of pressure, the like explosions and the pressure, like the steam is a function of pressure. And then the explosion is a function of pressure gone wrong. And then all of that is putting sort of these pressures on systems of circulation that are developing at the same time. One of the things that was happening is that the mail system, the postal system, was developing in the early 19th century. And that was really one of the things that drove the development of railroad and steamship networks. And the thing that drove those networks to develop was not actually personal mail or business mail, but newspapers and the circulation of news. And so I think all of these things are kind of inevitably connected. And one of the things I didn't know how to make the connection because it does feel a little bit too cute, but it seems important to me that the steamship, as it's pictured in the conflagration images, and the awful conflagration of the steamboat Lexington was just some of the most famous images. There were a lot of images of steamboats exploding or burning. Is that it's sort of the pressure of steam was exhilarating for people, as we see in the later Currier print of the steamboats racing, and steamboat races were huge news at the time, even though they sometimes did end in disaster and like killing 150 people. And so this image is at once picturing a tragedy that people responded to, but also embodying this sort of exhilarating part of antebellum American life, which was that suddenly everything was moving much more quickly. And I think that the images inevitably combine both of those sensations, and that's part of their appeal to it. So yeah, I mean, when I was reading and I was saying, oh, look, the steam presses are coming online at this time also, I was like, that seems connected. Perhaps, I mean, there's not really anyone at the time saying, oh yes, that's the connection we're drawing, but it felt inevitably so.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad to hear it doesn't sound like you're completely dismissing it. And I would say, because I don't know about the American context, but I do know that publications like The Graphic in London were really making a big deal. And in fact, in terms of advertising and celebrating their publications, were really focusing on their presses and steam presses and the kind of innovations that were possible. So if you think it is a potentially viable route, I would see if any of these publishers or printers were producing any kind of advertising or even editorial content that was focusing attention on, you know, the presses themselves, I think you might be able to find some kind of connection there.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Yeah, there are mentions. I mean, the Sun advertises its own processes all the time. I just haven't found that particular mention, perhaps.
Good. Okay.
Thank
Thanks.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. So I think that we unfortunately have run into the end of our time for this panel before the afternoon, but I wanted to thank you all for your terrific papers. And I will turn things over to Stephanie again.